Who are we talking about today on our little podcast?
Napoleon III, the nephew of
The nephew.
Napoleon.
Yeah, some would say the nephew who's not as famous, but might have been more impactful in the history of France, wouldn't you say?
Oh, I would say certainly. And in fact, a lot of his legacy is the infrastructure that's still there today. I mean, a lot of those train stations, those rails, the sewers, the aqueducts that bring in the clean water,
Yep.
That was him.
Yep. And ruled France for longer than his more famous uncle.
Yes. And not only that, but he went into 4 continents. So he was in Asia, Africa, North America, South America. So he geographically expanded far further than his uncle.
Yeah, I think a lot of people forget about that. So before we jump in, let me tell you a bit about Melissa. Like I said, she has a great Substack on Napoleon III, among other things. And the Substack is melissarossi.substack.com. She also has a series of books called What Every American Should Know About History. Could you touch on that briefly?
My first book for the series was What Every American Should Know About the Rest of the World.
Okay.
And then it evolved into a series. So there's What Every American Should Know About Europe, What Every American Should Know About lobbying, whatever, it morphed. But it has a lot of history in it.
Okay.
And so that's, when I was looking at the history of France in particular, I was blown away.
Yeah. And people can find those books on Amazon or wherever books are sold.
Yeah.
Okay. So
and I will say they're a little bit out of date as far as who's currently running countries, but the history is the history. So
it's but
still,
if you're interested in geopolitics, they're good books, and I recommend my great listeners take a look at them. And Melissa, let's dive into Napoleon III. He was born Charles Louis Napoleon Bonaparte in April 1808 to Napoleon's brother Louis Bonaparte. And that's Napoleon's younger brother, and his wife Hortense de Beauharnais, who was the daughter of Empress Josephine.
And Napoleon's stepdaughter.
Correct. And this was in Holland. They were rulers of Holland at the time. So what were his younger years like?
Well, first of all, I want to say something about their marriage.
Oh, yeah.
It was forced. I mean, neither Louis or Hortense they were both in love with other people. They did not really want to do it, but it was forced on them by Napoleon and Josephine because they wanted an heir, and Josephine wasn't producing one. So they thought, oh, we'll take the Bonaparte blood and Beauharnais blood and we'll blend it in, via Louis and Hortense. So it was a very, it was a sad marriage. And so right away she got pregnant, and Napoleon wanted to raise that kid, whose name was Charles, as his heir, but he died from croup at like age 4. So Josephine had 2 more sons. One, confusingly, one was known as the second one was Napoleon Louis, and the third one is Louis Napoleon.
Yeah.
And when, like I said, Louis was always really paranoid. So when this baby was born, the third one, he's like, he's born 10 days too late. I mean, 10 days too early for it to be mine. So, and when he said that, and he already had like sentries in front of his wife's door. He'd walled her into, so she just had it. And so she just left him up in Holland and went back to Paris. And so Louis Napoleon really never knew King Louis of Holland very well at all.
So his marriage, Hortense and Louis, was more of a marriage of empire building than it was of love.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
In fact, there was, I'd say, no love in that one. So when Louis Napoleon was born, he was always around Napoleon. Napoleon loved him. He was a really darling child, and everybody sort of cooed over him. But he was very thoughtful too. He was known for like giving. He saw a pauper on the street one day and he gave him his boots. He was just a really dear, wonderful child. Right. And then when Napoleon fell after the Battle of Waterloo the second time, and was shipped up to St. Helena, shortly thereafter in 1816, the Bonapartes were banished from France, as you know.
Right.
And most of them went to Italy. So that's where Louis Napoleon was. So Louis Napoleon took custody of the second child, Napoleon Louis, and raised him.
You can see why it gets confusing. Yeah.
There's too many Louis, there's too many Napoleons, there's too many Jeromes in this family. It gets really hard to research them and also hard to write about them because you're repeating the same names over and over. But the third child goes with Hortense, who was separated from Louis, to Switzerland.
Is that Napoleon III right there?
Yes.
We're talking.
They bought this castle manor in Ehrenberg. Which remains today. I believe it's now a museum in Switzerland. But anyway, so that's where he was raised.
All right. We'll just call him Napoleon III moving forward, just so we can kind of clarify him. Was he well educated?
He could have been. Initially, he had excellent tutors. They were very frustrated with him because he did not apply himself. He was much more into, riding. He looked good on a horse. He liked to ride a lot. Flirting up the girls. He was just a sort of a player, and just he was not serious about his studies until, and we're going to skip ahead for 1 second here, until he got locked up in prison, and for 6 years he caught up on everything, and then he actually became a fairly well-educated man.
I do wonder though, like you said, he basically was raised by his mother, so most of his upbringing and his character was shaped by Hortense as opposed to his dad, Louis.
Very much.
Okay.
Napoleon III, as a child, this idea was implanted in his head that he was going to rule, because Hortense was really into mystics, and she had had his horoscope done and stuff like that. And everybody was like, he's going to rule. And he starts telling people all the time, oh, when I'm the Emperor of France, everybody's like, what?
Right. It almost seems, and we're going to get to this, especially his first two coup attempts, like they were just complete pipe dream, long shot, no chance in hell type of efforts. But it seems like you were saying, like, either his mother put this idea in his head, like Inception, like you are going to be great one day, or and he just was believing it the whole time, and that what led to the coups. But I think that's interesting that you said that, Hortense really gave him, I don't know, it's not delusions of grandeur, but that you can be greater than you think you are.
I think it would actually be delusions of grandeur.
Oh, okay.
I think you could go that far. Also, Napoleon, before he went to Russia, so this is 1812, Louis was saying, don't go, because what if you die, it would be very bad for France. Right. And Napoleon had turned to his aide and said, like, keep your eye on this one. Someday he may rule the French. And that made and I'm sure Hortense repeated that a million times to him too. But anyway, that made an impression on him as well.
So let's jump ahead to 1832. Napoleon the first son, Napoleon II, dies of an illness at the young age of 21.
Tuberculosis.
Right. So people always ask me, well, why is he Napoleon III? That's kind of why, right? Like, even though Napoleon II dies, he gives respect to, his, Napoleon II's, like, I guess, honor or memory.
Yeah. Yes. So it was memorializing. Initially, Napoleon III did want to be known as Napoleon II, but ultimately out of respect for the King of Rome, or the Duke of Reichstadt, as he was known, and who had absolutely no intention or desire to rule France. When he died, it's out of respect to him that he went with Napoleon III.
Okay, now the other interesting part about this is, now this is 1832, so this is 17 years after Napoleon's abdication and exile. Was Bonapartism still strong in France and in Europe at this time?
It's hard to assess, but there was some support. There certainly was some support, and there was some support from people in the military who had fought with Napoleon, like the Battle of Waterloo. And so some people, and this was a time when France was glorious. It was make France great again. It was held in such esteem. However, in certain parts like Brittany, which is on the west of France, and where they still didn't really speak French, they spoke, their language. There was a lot of resentment, even when Napoleon was alive. So it was mixed. But Napoleon III, even around this time, he starts getting out this propaganda. So there
Right.
was this image of, oh, that's when France was great. And there were people that were in support of bringing back an emperor and wanted that same kind of greatness again.
Yeah. Yeah. And he enrolls in the Swiss army as an artillery officer, like his famous uncle was. Now, obviously, he can't enroll in the French army because he's still exiled. How is his military prowess?
Regarding how he was as a military man, he knew artillery. He knew the strategies, and he had studied. He was really into what his uncle has done, so he studied a lot of those details. However, he had no stomach for war. So literally on the battlefield, he was getting sick to his stomach. He really was. I mean, I'm not saying he wasn't brave, because he was, but it just nauseated him.
Right. Yeah, I could see that. And he also writes a lot of, like you mentioned, political philosophy and pamphlets during this time. And I have a quote here. It says, "I believe that from time to time, men are created whom I call volunteers of Providence, in whose hands are placed the destiny of their countries. I believe that I am one of these men. If I am wrong, I can perish uselessly. If I'm right, then Providence will put me into a position to fulfill my mission." End quote. Is that, like you kind of said, delusions of grandeur, or is he a pipe dreamer? I'm trying to get his sense.
He was a pipe dreamer, but he just believed it so much. He ultimately manifested it. And I believe he wrote that right before he went his Strasbourg attempt. Earlier, maybe it was 1835, like late 1835. He meets this guy named Victor Persigny. And Persigny is a nut. He's a fanatic. He's a total Bonapartist. So he's like everything Bonaparte. Oh, we got and so when Napoleon, the future Napoleon III, tells him, "Oh, I'm going to be emperor," Persigny's like, "Yes, you are, and I'm going to help you." and he was a propagandist and a reporter at this time. He helped him plan this, and also right before this attempt, he had gotten Louis Napoleon was engaged to his cousin Mathilde, and who was the daughter of Jerome. And so, but all the Bonapartes were petitioning the French king, Louis Philippe, and they kept on saying, "We're not going to try anything. Just let us come back to France," But Louis Napoleon, so the future Napoleon III, has these dreams with Persigny. So they start going there. So they decide they should go to Strasbourg because it's in the east, and so they could get there from. They were always going into Germany, from Germany to Switzerland, so they start doing recon, and so they do find this colonel of the 4th Artillery Regiment, and he was unhappy with the French government because he wanted to be a general.
Strasbourg makes sense. Like it's far away from Paris that it won't be crushed immediately. Maybe they could bring like a groundswell of popular revolt and then bring it to Paris,
Exactly. And that's what they planned on doing. But Louis Napoleon was obsessed because when his uncle had left Elba, he said, I will take France back bloodlessly without
firing shots.
And so Louis Napoleon was like, okay, we got to make this bloodless. Don't kill anybody. So he did have, when he goes in, he did have this colonel's regiment. So he had like 1,000 backers. At least this is according to some accounts. The one that I believe. And so he did have that. But as they go through the town, Vive l'Empereur, just thinking that everybody's going to bow.
Right.
It didn't turn out that way. And there was another regiment that that would not support him. So he ended up, it's just a joke. He ends up arrested and thrown in prison.
So not the way he dreamed it up.
No. But he was. But his mother, Hortense, begged King Louis Philippe to be lenient with him. And Louis, it was almost like he was amused by it, but he gives him a bunch of money. and he sends him off. He's like, you're banished to the United States. And they take the slow boat to Virginia, and it takes like 4 months to get there. They stop in Brazil and whatever, So finally he shows up in Virginia, and he gets a letter that Hortense is really sick with cancer. Right. And so he's only there like 8 months. Anyway, so he had to sneak back in with a fake passport to go through England and then get back to Switzerland. And so he was with her last few weeks there.
Yeah. And I think he gets a big inheritance from her after her death,
yes.
Right? Okay.
Yes.
So now he's able to finance his delusions of grandeur.
Yes. So he puts out a pamphlet about how great the Strasbourg attempt was, and it really riles all the power elites in Paris. And so they tell the Swiss government, you have to get rid of him or we're going to invade. And anyway, so he sets himself up sort of a martyr. But so then he moves to London. So he's there a few years. Okay. And he keeps on getting these pamphlets, and he's buying up the newspapers that are the Bonapartist newspapers. So he's getting, he's still working the ground there. This is probably Persigny too. And in 1840, the king, in a big PR move, because he wanted to be equated somehow with the greatness of Napoleon, he brings back the remains of Napoleon, who had died in 1821. So 19 years later.
And I did read about that. Like, his support was waning, King Louis Philippe. And I think that was kind of like a long shot to like bring back his support, but it didn't really work. Even though the funeral was very popular, he remained unpopular.
Yes. I mean, he was, yes. I mean, there were some economic woes at the time as well. I mean, he was not a bad guy, as kings go. He wasn't as selfish as many of them. So Louis Napoleon and Persigny again, and a couple colonels, decide they're going to strike again. Try
again. Okay. How did this one go?
Well, they rented a steamer, like a pleasure steamer, and they told the guy they were going somewhere else. And anyway, and they load up like 8 horses, some carriages, and a bunch of rifles, and they're picking up people along the way. Oh, and Louis Napoleon had specially made like French army uniforms, and they had like the number 40 on the buttons, because they were trying to pretend that when they got into town, they were going to pretend that they were part of the 40th Regiment. So anyway, they get up. Oh, they have a live eagle. So they get on the boat. They land a couple miles away. And 2 Coast Guard guys see them.
They land in France. Yeah.
Yes. So and this is across the English Channel. So now they're going for Boulogne, and as they're approaching, these guards seem like, who are you? And they're, we're with the 40th Regiment, blah blah blah. And these Coast Guards don't really believe them, but they accompany them to the town. They get to the barracks where the lieutenant gets and they are winning over some people. But somehow then the Coast Guard has told the general, I believe it's a general, I don't want to misstate his
an officer of some sort.
The one who's normally in charge, and they wake him up, and so they're starting to get vive l'empereur. But the commander comes in and he's like, no, vive le roi. The soldiers are confused. In this, somehow there's a scuffle. Of the 50 men he shows up with, they're like his servants. They're like his and the servants of his friends. So these are people, most of them are not military people. They don't know what they're doing. Right. So anyway, somewhere a soldier gets shot, not fatally, but anyway. So all the soldiers turn against Louis Napoleon and his forces, and they run him out of town. At one point, he did get in the town. He was throwing gold coins. They're flapping the eagle around. Vive l'Empereur. They have pamphlets. But I guess the alarm drums. There wasn't a bell, it was drums. And the National Guard and the citizens come out because these drums are beating, like it's an emergency. And they chase Louis Napoleon and his troops, his servants in uniforms.
Entourage, yeah.
Yes, and back to the water, and so there's a scramble to get to a boat. There was a small boat that they were going to take to get back to the steamer. But when they get in it, it capsizes, and so he was, by some accounts, he was drowning. But anyway, so they got him.
So he's captured, and I'm sure King Louis Philippe has had enough of this clown by now, and he sentences him to life in prison in 1840.
It's actually like the Senate. He apparently he gave a very eloquent testimony, but they were like, no, to the prison of Ham for life you go.
Right. As you mentioned before, he makes good use of his 6 years in prison by reading and writing a lot, correct?
Yes. And he used a lot of his money because he's used a lot of his money on that coup attempt too. And then he revamped. So he had sort of a large area, but it was cold and damp. Or he revamped it and turned it into like a library and a scientific lab. And, it was like a jail suite, pretty nice.
Right.
And he's hanging out and playing cards and drinking wine with the warden every night. And he, the maid, the housemaid, the housekeeper, he starts an affair with her. He has 2 kids with her.
Right.
And he writes a pamphlet called The End to Pauperism. So the end of poverty, and lays out some ideas that he did actually put into use, including making a banking system that would help the workers. And he also had some ideas for agricultural improvement. It was very widely read in France, and so this really planted a seed for what would happen later. There was like, he's okay, so he's not very good at his coup attempts, but he is a caring, intelligent man that's going to take care of us.
And I think we'll touch base on that, on his legacy later, because I think he did a lot for the poor of France and under his empire. So we'll come back to that. I do want to talk about his escape from prison, because that's kind of a story in itself. How did that go down? If you can briefly summarize that one.
Well, he was in the prison with this doctor, Dr. Canot, and Dr. Canot's like, oh, Louis is sick, and so they don't let the guards in that day, or saying, oh, he's too ill, he can't see anybody. And in the meantime, Louis has like, I'm trying to remember, did he shave off his mustache or whatever? He somehow disguised his looks, and he has a construction worker's outfit, and so anyway, he just walks out of the prison like a construction worker, and then he went to Belgium first, and then he went to England.
Yeah, it's just a funny little story, because like you said, he's playing cards with the warden. It doesn't sound like he was being too strict, kept in this prison.
No, for a lot of the people back then, I'm surprised almost all the Bonapartes were in prison at one point or another, but but not for that long.
Yeah. Even Napoleon himself was in prison for a little while. But we jump ahead to 1848 because, well, he has a long story, but because things start to look brighter for Napoleon III.
Right.
What happens when King Louis Philippe abdicates in the face of a revolution?
So they get rid of the king in 1848, and Second Republic starts. They have a new constitution, and they grant universal male suffrage. So because of all his propaganda efforts, here, and he's mostly in London at this time, so you have this guy that speaks French with a thick German accent, because that's what he had learned in Switzerland. Right. He's an escaped convict from French prison. He's living in London with this courtesan, and he is the first elected president of France.
Yeah, it's shocking. And I, his opponents sometimes ridiculed him. One comparing him to, quote, a turkey who believes he's an eagle, end quote. But reading up on it, it seems like his opponents were either extreme left or extreme right, and he was kind of in the middle. And he also had the army supporting him due to his ties with the glory of Napoleon. Did his opponents just underestimate this guy?
They thought he was a cretin. almost all the people in the parliament at the time, or the
Right.
major politicians. But they were like, we're only going to have to suffer this fool for 4 years, because the new constitution said you could only have a 1 year, I mean, a 4-year term, one term
Right.
for 4 years.
Right.
And so early on, though, he meets two people that are important. One is Victor Hugo. He promises him the position of education minister.
Right.
And then but he gives it to somebody else. So Hugo, who's also a parliamentarian, joins this faction of people that block everything that the prince president wants to do.
Yep.
And he also meets early on in his presidency his mysterious, he didn't know existed, half-brother, Charles Duc de Mornay.
Yep.
And he's a very popular, he's well known, he's really well connected, really rich businessman. And it's when he brings his half-brother into his scheme, that's what made it stick.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting part. That, like you said earlier, they're like, we'll just have to, deal with this guy for 3 or 4 years. But what I think was smart on Napoleon III's part is he's building his power base during this time. He's not just some figurehead sitting there doing nothing. Like he's really organizing his power.
Yes, but he couldn't get anything done. What he ended up doing was he fulfilled a lot of Napoleon's unfulfilled goals. And one of those was to renovate France, and he couldn't get anything. So in 1851, he's been in there 3 years. He hasn't gotten anything done, and he can't run again.
Right. So what he does do is he initiates a coup d'etat to retain his power and prevent another election. And as soon after declared emperor, I mean, that's just what an amazing turn of events, right?
Yeah. I mean, and initially he told everybody. I think he even put this, had a referendum on this one. I'll be president for 10 years. So that was the initial thing. And then later in 1852, he's like, no, I will be emperor. But there was a problem, because he had this Harriet Howard, who was rich, and she really bankrolled, because when he went back to London the second time, he didn't have as much money. She was bankrolling a lot of this effort.
Right.
So when he's declared emperor, or when he declares himself emperor, in 1852, in December, he needs a wife.
Yeah, let's talk about Eugenie, who he marries not long after he becomes emperor, 1853.
She was really into fashion. She was a Spanish, like, countess, or a Spanish noble, shall we say. She was considered a great beauty at the time. She was not his first choice. They were sending out feelers all over the place for actual princesses, and they're like, nope. You can't marry that one.
Right.
Nobody wanted to gamble on this new empire. So anyway, but she was willing. So he got rid of the courtesan and sent her off, made her a countess, sent her off to a castle, and woos and quickly marries this Eugenie, de Montijo.
And they had a number of kids, though, correct?
No, only one.
Only one.
Okay. And that was like 3 years later. So they married in 1853. Louis Napoleon, or Napoleon, the imperial prince, was born 3 years later in 1856.
Well, let's talk about, he's in control now. How were his foreign policy efforts? It seems like they were successful at first. Crimean War was a victory for France and the Allies, and he had success in Italy. So it seems like his empire started off on the right foot.
You could say that it made France very the most powerful military in Europe, but a lot of these wars, and he sort of got into the Crimean thing. It didn't really affect France. He just wanted a victory and to say, we're back in the game.
Right.
In Solferino, that was one of the Italian battles. That was a slaughter. It was horrible. In fact, this businessman is going to look for him because he went something about water rights in Algeria, and comes across tens of thousands of men on the battlefield, injured and screaming, and founds the Red Cross as a result of that. And the Geneva Conventions and things came out of that. So a lot of his military efforts I think, and the whole thing is seizing Mexico.
Yeah.
In some ways, like his foreign policy, he made friends with Queen Victoria. He was friends with King Emmanuel of Italy. He was, he was making France much more friendly, had more allies than it did under his uncle's time.
Right.
But these would fall off because he made so many errors and bad choices. What he was doing from the very start, though, his biggest priority was renovating Paris.
Yeah. Yeah. And needed, I mean, Napoleon, his uncle, had done some renovations because, I mean, before that, it was like a medieval town. But I know we're talking now 50 years after, or 40 or 50 years after Napoleon I, right? So, I mean, the streets needed widened. Like you said, the public works needed improved. What happened there?
First of all, he put in wide boulevards. Now, some people say this was so the military could control the population, so they wouldn't have these barricades like where they were always fighting the government from these hidden. But anyway, so he brought in. So he made this new. If you've been to Paris, all of the buildings have this like beige. There's beige stone, and they all have wrought iron balconies, and they all have mansard roofs.
They're beautiful.
And this was from this era when he hired Baron Haussmann to be his administrator to make Paris the capital of capitals. And they put in a lot of parks, Bois de Boulogne, the Tuileries, the gardens there turned into places where the public could hear concerts as captured in a Manet painting. Suddenly there were all these open spaces. He was very much influenced by his time in London. So he was trying to create like the Hyde Parks for Paris, and they were incredibly popular. So from this closed medieval rat warrens, most of Paris became, open and with this grand architecture, and he's building new train stations and new markets. And this is a big deal. He lays down, like at the beginning of his reign, there were like 3,000 miles of rail. By the end of it, there's like 15,000. So it's, rails going in all over the place, telegraph wires, photography is taking off. He's backing the sciences. He's backing Louis Pasteur. He gets involved with the Suez Canal. And it was only completed because of Napoleon III. So
he's really modernizing the country. I read something that he found Paris stinking and left it gleaming or something like that. Like he really did a lot to not only improve the country, but Paris itself. Yes.
They called him the magician emperor because what he was doing was it just had changed it so much. He also had 2 world fairs, like international exhibitions. I'm trying to remember the exact name, but anyway, there were like 2 world fairs and brought in, so you were seeing like not only the architecture of China and Japan, but, technological advances. And it's where the first hydraulic elevator was shown. And so all these, there's all, Paris becomes the magnet of a magnet for the rich and the wealthy everywhere. So ambassadors are all vying to come there. Playboy princes want to come there. There's beautiful restaurants. It's got the best opera. It's got the best ballets. It's got the best. It's got racetracks. And casinos come into France.
Yeah, and I've been to Paris, and you can almost, when you're out those outdoor cafes, you can almost close your eyes and kind of go back in time.
Yes. So all the infrastructure. Really, the bulk of the infrastructure in Paris was put in during this period of Napoleon III, and he gets pretty much no credit for that.
Yeah, and he should. We'll come back to that on the legacy talk. Let's talk about now, just like his uncle, there was a decline of the empire and in the emperor's health. It seems he had chronic pain in his legs and feet from his times as a prisoner. He also smoked heavily. Was he kind of in the 1860s? Was he in decline, similar to his empire?
Yeah, and you can really say that it wasn't until like 1867, 1860. That Mexico thing plays into this too. Yes, he was, but he had kidney stones.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe he had gallstones too. He had a lot of stones. But yes, he was getting really sick.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was not, and he wasn't, he was also really worried that he was going to lose it. You know, this great dream world that he had created from the very beginning, because of what the astrologer had told his mother long before, that it would end in disaster. So he was worried.
Yeah. And during this time, Prussia is becoming a rising force in Europe and a threat to France's power on the continent. And I think almost, well, like, in my opinion, why do you think Napoleon III went to war with Prussia in 1870?
I think this is, you were asking me about what I thought about Eugenie. Well, she was Spanish and very devout. And so there was it was something that should not have really concerned France at all. But they wanted to put how's it? Hohenzollern.
Hohenzollern.
Yeah, I have a hard time with that name. So which was the royal house that was the King of Prussia was from this. They wanted to put one of his relatives on the Spanish throne, and Protestant. And so Eugenie was very upset about this. Mm. And, of course, she had his ear. There was an incident where the French ambassador saw the Prussian king in a beach town and said, we want to make sure that you will never put one of your relatives on the Spanish throne. Will you guarantee that? Mm-hmm. And the king said, yeah, I'm not going to guarantee it. But anyways, and so this is conveyed to the diplomats or whatever. But Otto Bismarck gets a hold of this and turns it into that French ambassador said they were going to, the France would go to war over this, and it got exaggerated in this M's telegram.
Yeah,
called.
Yeah,
and it was a trick. It was a trick because at this point, France militarily was just overextended, and
they're all over the world at this time.
Yeah, so he had just pulled them back from Mexico in 1967. And so they had, they were going all over the place. It was just, it was scattered. Mm-hmm. He was like, again, with his foreign policy, what are you doing? Yeah. So they were not the same force that they were when in Crimea, and Bismarck knew this.
Yeah. They go to war in 1870. Spoiler alert, it did not go well for France. And despite his declining health, Napoleon III goes to the front to inspire his army.
Yeah.
How did that work out?
It was stupid. It was just, it's just like you're going, what? What was you? And he was really sick. Yeah. He had I don't remember, it was the gallstones or the kidney stones. He was very, very ill. And, but he wanted to make this appearance. And, within 2 months, it was over. Yeah. And it just took down the Second French Empire overnight.
Yeah, and they're, decisively beaten quickly in the Franco-Prussian War. And
painfully.
And his empire goes up, like you said, almost overnight. It's he's captured by the Prussians and his army is destroyed. What happens kind of after that? What were his final years like?
Well, let's go back to Paris, because this has a lot to do with his legacy. Sure. So they start the Third Republic. And the Third Republic, for reasons that I just don't understand, decides that they're going to continue the war against Prussia. Mm-hmm. Okay, and at least and so Prussia has Paris surrounded. Yeah, and the siege of Paris, nothing could get in or out. Mm-hmm. And so the people, they are reduced to eating rats. Mm-hmm. And this really, they blamed him for that fall in a way that nobody or few blamed Napoleon and Waterloo. They just were so upset that it was such a horrible siege. Mm-hmm. that and then it turns into a sort of localized civil war in Paris, and so in the meantime he's gone to England. Yeah. And so he was in England for 3 years, but he's just getting, he's getting trashed, you know, in Paris. And the Third Republic blamed everything on him.
Right.
Victor Hugo comes back and writes another thing, and it's just scathing about, you know, the crime of the Second French Empire. And he'd been in exile all along, writing these really critical things.
And Napoleon was the first. I mean, Waterloo was an awful battle, but I think there was a humiliation to the Battle of Sedan, which really upset France. And I think that's what you're kind of referencing with Hugo, is that there was something about that loss. It was so total and devastating and surprising that it took France a long time to get over.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, there was the same way that propaganda had gotten him into power. Now there's like negative propaganda.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, you know, he didn't do anything. It was all Haussmann. And it was really Louis Napoleon's vision. And again, but he was taking a lot of his ideas from his uncle, from Napoleon. You know, it's just like stuff that Napoleon didn't have time because he was too busy fighting to get around to.
Right. And it's just tragic. You know, he basically lives out the rest of his life in England as a sick man and dies in 1873.
Yeah, 3 years after that stupid war he got into because of Eugenie, if you ask me. So yeah, it's really quite sad.
So this question then is tricky one. What do you think his legacy is?
I think I think his legacy, to what's really there, what is not widely acknowledged, is modern Paris is his legacy. The interconnected trains are his legacy. The modern, well, they're not for that era. The industrial, I mean, he was helping the Industrial Revolution. He really brought France up to speed. The Suez Canal that he funded the completion of, the Red Cross that he funded the creation of. I mean, these are just a few of the things. Oh, and margarine. I can't forget that, because he was concerned that the poor couldn't afford butter. So he had a scientist like develop margarine.
Yeah, and I think he did a lot for, like you said, the poverty-stricken areas of Paris and France, and he doesn't get enough credit for some of his efforts.
Yeah, and what he also did was, I could tell you a wild story. He made loans available for the workers and for the lower middle class, and so a lot of small businesses grew up because of this. And the guilds could fund new projects. So there was a lot of energizing, a lot of enterprises that these were funded. And I'll tell you a real quick story here. There was a guy, a farmer from central France, and it was a bad crop year. He had to walk to Paris to become a stone cutter, a day worker. So it took a few days to walk to Paris. So he camped out overnight in the woods. And when he woke up in the morning, he realized that there was a quarry that had not been discovered. And so he was on thinking, I'm going to buy this quarry. He makes a map. On his deathbed, he gives the map. He's never mentioned this to anybody. He gives the map to his son. And he says, son, you got to buy this quarry. During the financing part of this Second French Empire, the son got a loan, bought the quarry, and the stones from that quarry became Sacre Coeur.
Oh, no way.
The beautiful church in Montmartre, and they also renovated. I mean, there was so much devastation after the localized civil war in 1871 that there was a lot of. So suddenly, all these oxen are coming up from central France, but so things like that he made possible.
Yeah, it strikes me like, I mean, if you want to count 1848 as part of his rule too, like, you know, he ruled the country well for 22 years. Yes, he made a terrible mistake in 1870 going to war, but it's almost like he doesn't get appreciated for those 22 years of relative peace and prosperity. He just gets blamed for that one mistake in 1870.
I was just having a conversation with a Frenchman. It's like he's given no credit, really no credit.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I think there should be more research and articles if you want to go see go to melissarossi.substack.com. You can find some of those articles. And there's also subscriptions there if you want to get really in detail, correct?
Yeah. So there's free subscriptions where you get like some gratis articles and a half an article, and I hope it's an interesting half of an article. And then there's paid subscriptions where you get the whole article. And I don't know. I try and be, egalitarian.
Yeah.
But I don't, when people are paying, I want them to have a little bit more than the non-paying. But anyway, so it's really fun. It's all these aspects of the Bonapartes that are forgotten.
But yeah, wrapping up, Melissa, that was a fabulous episode. If you want to learn more about Melissa, like I said, you can grab one of her books on Amazon or check her out on melissarossi.substack.com. And yeah, it was a pleasure having you on the show today.
I was thrilled to be asked, and it's just this is the most interesting topic in the world to me. Let me tell you, and like you said, there's so many aspects to it.
Yeah, well, it really comes through, and you convey it very well. So I thank you very much, and we'll talk soon.